Growing up, I spent a lot of time playing games. Video games, card games, board games. But the type of game I played most often were word games, like Scrabble, Bananagrams, Words with Friends. Knowing this, it comes as no shock that I'd be interested in linguistics and etymology. How do baffling words like kernel come about? Why do we have a silent E on so many words? Why does the English language function the way it does? I've decided to use this documentary to answer two questions. How did the English language come to where it is now? And how does our language affect our relationships today? To find the answer to how a language that is alive and well was born, I began with a language that is dead.
Oh, how do we get here? Oh my gosh, that's like an entire college course at least.
Laura Edwardson has been my Latin teacher for 2 years. She studied classical languages in college with a concentration in Latin.
I feel like so many things have left their imprint on the history of the English language that you start out with this Germanic-based language, you get the influx of Norman French, you get the influx of everything from the Romance languages. You get people inventing new words in the Renaissance. But you also have all these other smaller groups.
English began in around 449 AD with the arrival of 3 Germanic tribes in Britain. Their combined dialects became known as Anglo-Saxon, which became the foundation for Old English. Old English is the language of stories like Beowulf, the Battle of Maldon, and the Seafarer. Most modern English speakers wouldn't be able to read or understand it on account of it looking like this. But soon enough, the French were going to change that. In 1066, the Normans conquered England, and the French became the ruling class over the English. The 3 languages, Latin, French, and English, didn't really mix at first.
The thing that always interested me about the Norman conquest was how food words are, this sounds so funny, but the food words like pork and beef and all that stuff, those are all French words.
Yes.
And like Latin, it's porcus, and then I have no idea what it is in French because I'll ruin the French pronunciation, and then it comes into English as pork because you had French chefs cooking for the French nobility and they spoke French at court. But it was the English who were raising the animals, calling them swine and cows, and they're sheep, but when you cook it, it's mutton, and you have all this influence.
The shortest era of the English language, Middle English, began in 1150 and survived up until the middle of the Renaissance in 1450. At this point, the Latin-derived French language was injecting words and grammar rules into English. Words like castle, romance, and poet began to come in from French. Some words even came in directly from Latin, as it was still being used as a language in a religious context. English, at this point, is a bit more familiar to us.
I feel like it's a hodgepodge historical record of everything that English speakers have ever done, been through, groups that have come in. And so I think that's one of the things that might make English difficult for people to learn. English is a really difficult language because it has so many exceptions, so many irregulars, so many weird rules. And it's because you've got little traces of all these bits of historical influence that, well, these words do this because they have a Latin root, and that was the rule in Latin. And these words do this because they have a Germanic root, and that was the rule in Old English.
It's best to think of Middle English as a transitional period for the language, a 300-year bridge of sorts from Old to Modern English. Many a high school student will read Shakespeare and think of it as Old English. However, as we've seen before, Shakespeare is child's play compared to trying to read actual Old English. The works of Shakespeare are works of modern English made during the Renaissance. Because of the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg and an explosion of science and artistry, new words began to spring about. Shakespeare alone invented around 20,000 words like gossip, buzzer, and lonely, to name a few. From there, the language evolved to what it is today.
I mean, I think that language is shifting constantly. The question always becomes how long before the shift becomes noticeable. So you have these tiny little minuscule shifts that happen on a daily basis. And if you just go from one day to the next, you're like, it doesn't register. But if you were to take someone from 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they haven't heard any of those changes in between, then it would be so much more noticeable.
Language is, in many ways, akin to an organism. It evolves to fit the needs of its surroundings, and its evolution may not always make sense. But unlike a living thing, language changes quickly, especially now. The Renaissance had the invention of the printing press, which increased literacy and therefore communication between people. In 2019, we have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat. We have all these ways to communicate, all these little ecosystems in this thing we call the World Wide Web. And inside these ecosystems, you find communities of people who use vocabulary that you might not find in a typical dictionary. Slang is not a new concept, not by a long shot. Every generation has their own vernacular that is used to convey their ideas and emotions. Most people seem to pick up these words in their teen years.
You know, the older generations are going, oh, the kids these days, you know, they don't know how to talk, they've got these weird, but they're not thinking about the fact that they were doing the exact same thing, and what sounds old-fashioned to us now sounded, you know, trendy and you know, stupid teenager talk to the generation, you know, that preceded them.
Slang is a particularly fluid part of language. It's what sets each generation apart. However, one of the differences between words traveling in the past versus now is that these slang words spread much faster because of
social media.
So in conjunction with figuring out how the English language evolved, I collected 5 students from different social groups and 4 teachers of different ages and asked them about their own personal English language. There was one problem that was immediately evident.
Whereas I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
It's hurt, like I can't think of a lot.
Now I'm blanking on all of the slang.
Why am I drawing a blank?
Oh, I'm old. I can't remember what slang I used.
Almost all the people who said they used a lot of slang in their everyday life couldn't actually recall the words they used when I asked them. At first. With some thought, we managed to come up with a few.
The slang that I know and say almost every day are the word y'all in text, the word tea, the word shook, mood, yes, mood. Same, yes, same. And like saying me.
It's lit.
Yeah, good tough is T-U-F-F, and then bad tough is T-O-U-G-H.
And a couple students used little or no slang at all.
This year, I've been speaking a lot with adults and kind of just speaking with older people, so I'm not it's not appropriate to use as much slang as I used to.
I actually don't indulge in it that much, like texting language. I don't, or I don't know, a lot of new fashioned words. I tend to stray away from those.
The fact that it was difficult to remember any words at all, I think, is more telling than the words themselves. In fact, when I asked the teachers what kinds of words they heard from students, they seemed to remember more of the younger generation's words than the students could, specifically the teachers under 40 years old.
RT, like retweet.
Extra.
Yeah, there's John. Spill the tea. Lol and JK.
Bougie.
Oh, you're dope a bunch. I've been hearing some za for pizza. Sick burn.
Lit's a good one.
AF, that's another one. Thick, with 3 C's and a Q.
The teachers over 40 had somewhat different attitudes towards knowing what slang their students use.
So I can't tell you what I remember, but I just feel out of the loop when they say it. And that's okay, because I'm at the age where I'm the older guy and I'm not worried about what they feel like I'm out of it because I'm old anyway. I'm not trying to be with it.
I think that I've tried to create an atmosphere, an environment of being open and trying different things. And when I don't understand something, I'm quick to ask, what does that mean? For the most part, students are honest with me.
So why is it so difficult to recall the language you use every day?
Slang is also really ingrained into our culture and just in our minds in general. I feel like subconsciously, it just happens, you know? It's not something I actively think about when I'm going to say it.
It kind of just comes naturally. Like, sometimes I'll just be like the first person to say it and then my friends will just go along with it.
Slang becomes part of our personalities. The way we speak is second nature, and so it's difficult to think of specific examples when asked out of context. It's like when someone makes you aware of your own breathing. With the actual content of language aside, I moved on to the effect of language. When asked whether the words we use affects people's perceptions of us, the answer was almost always,
Yeah, I think it can.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I think it could.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. I tell kids that all the time.
Oh, definitely.
Definitely.
Many people brought up an example of a job interview as a situation where slang wouldn't be acceptable.
Linguistically, it's called register, that there's different ways that you speak depending upon whether it's an interview or you're talking to your friends or you're talking to close family or you're talking to the Queen of England. I mean, you shouldn't speak the exact same way in each of those situations. If you are always informal and overly informal in serious situations, like you're going for a job interview and you're talking to the interviewer as if you're sitting around the lunch table talking to your friends, that may not play well, depending upon the interviewer. On the other hand, if you're always speaking to everyone as if you are at an interview, then people are like, what is up with you? You're weird.
We all speak differently depending on the situation. It's a natural and necessary part of how we communicate. How you speak in any given circumstance is not a direct reflection of how you are all the time.
But the thing I observe now is even like really intelligent kids, really respectable kids, they use slang all the time. So I think the effect, like how people view your personality if you use slang, the effect that would have is becoming less and less as more and more people start to use slang.
Because if I seem to talk more similar with the student, like more similar to how the students talk than how the other colleagues talk, then my age is going to be even more apparent that, oh, he's just a kid. Yeah. It's like, or I'm an adult who just happens to like slang.
That's the thing about language. It's fluid, it's always changing, and it's different for everyone who speaks it. So what really is the point of all this? Why is it important to know where English comes from and its connection to our everyday slang?
So, I mean, I think this is a hard question because we were saying before we started that, like, you know, your attitude is kind of like, well, why wouldn't you want to? That and acknowledging that, like, the language is always changing. So it's like, you know, you want to say, like, this is the rule, and it's not. This is the rule that we've all agreed to for the moment. Yeah. It's not, this is the rule for all of eternity.
What's important about the English language is not knowing exactly which dates are associated with which era of the language. It's about recognizing that it isn't a closed system. Words come in, words become obsolete, words change pronunciation and spelling just because that's what people are inclined to do. Remember when I mentioned the word colonel? Turns out it came from the Latin for column, turned into the Italian word for column of soldiers, then that word combined with the French word colonel to become coronel. Finally, that word combined with the English coronel, and the R changed back to the L, but retained the pronunciation. English speakers used the word coronel until the 17th century. The silent E on the ends of words like slate and care used to be pronounced, but it became silent in the transition from Middle to Modern English. 100 years from now, people will probably still be studying Shakespeare and other English works and words of old, but they will also be studying our words. They'll look back at our slang and wonder how we got words like finna or tea in those contexts. They'll study our movies, our newscasts, our tweets, our YouTube videos, our Instagram posts, and wonder how anyone could have ever spoken like that.